As you may have noticed, I was on crutches for 2 months this semester. I had already been on crutches for 3 months before that, and last year I was on them for 7 months. You see, I've had hip surgery 3 times in the last year and a half. It all started in October 1985 when I experienced my first serious car accident. I swerved off the road to avoid a head-on collision with another car. My car rolled over and struck a large tree. I was not wearing a seatbelt. In the process of being thrown back and forth across the car, I chipped a tooth, cut the back of my head, broke my hip, and cracked 3 ribs, which resulted in a punctured lung and massive internal bleeding. When they got me to the hospital, my blood pressure was down from a normal 120/70 to 50/30 as a result of all the internal and external bleeding, and as a result of shock. Doctors waited more than 24 hours to do surgery to repair my hip because they didn't think I was going to survive all of my other injuries. Somehow I survived, and now a year and a half later I'm finally walking normally, though I will be walking around for the rest of my life with a piece of metal this long in my hip, and I'm not allowed to do any athletic activities that require running. All that pain and suffering could have been avoided if only I had been in the habit of wearing a seatbelt. But I wasn't in that habit, and I know from my class survey that 40% of you do not usually wear a seatbelt, and 75% of you do not always wear one. Yet the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration tells us that each person stands a 1 in 3 chance of being in a serious auto accident at some time in his or her life. So we can possibly predict that 1/3 of you will be in a serious accident at some point. And it may sound corny, but I mean it, so I'm going to say it. I don't want what happened to me to happen to any of you. So I want to talk to you about wearing seatbelts. First, I'm going to tell you to what extent you will be protected by wearing a seatbelt. Then I'm going to look at some of the reasons why people don't wear seatbelts and point out the problems with those reasons. And after I've given you the evidence, I'm going to ask you all to make a habit of wearing seatbelts. So first, to what extent will you be protected by wearing a seatbelt? Well, the Wisconsin Department of Transportation says that if you are in an accident and are not wearing a seatbelt, you are 4 times more likely to be killed than if you are wearing one. Furthermore, consider this. There are 35,000 deaths each year in the United States as a result of traffic accidents. The National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the National Child Passenger Safety Association, and the Wisconsin Department of Transportation all estimate that traffic deaths would decrease from 35,000 to around 17,000 annually if everyone wore seatbelts. So our most knowledgeable and reliable sources of information on seatbelts have all come to the same conclusion, that we would cut traffic deaths in half if everyone wore seatbelts, and that we would save 18,000 lives each year. Now let me put that number into perspective. 18,000 people, or the equivalent of more than half the undergraduates on this campus, are needlessly killed every year because they do not wear seatbelts. But why is this true? What does a seatbelt do to protect you? Well, in a head-on collision, which is usually the worst type, your body will be thrown forward into the steering wheel, into the dashboard, or through the windshield with incredible force. Imagine falling head first from the top of a 3-story building. The force with which you would land on the ground is equal to the force with which you would be thrown forward in only a 30-mile-per-hour collision. But a seatbelt will absorb that force and prevent you from slamming into the interior of the car. In my own experience, there is little doubt that a seatbelt would have minimized my injuries. I looked at pictures of the car after my accident. The car was totaled, and it was an ugly mess. But the 2 front seats and the entire driving compartment were completely intact. I have to believe that if I had been strapped into that seat, I would have walked away from my accident with minor bruises. But remember, I used the word if I had worn a safety belt. So the evidence is strongly in favor of wearing seat belts. That brings me to the next question. Why don't people wear seat belts? People often say that in an accident they would rather be thrown free of the car or at least be able to get out of the car in case of fire or submersion in water? Well, according to the Wisconsin Department of Transportation, accidents involving fire and submersion make up less than 1 out of every 200 auto accidents. Furthermore, you are actually more likely to be able to get out of the car if you are wearing a seatbelt, because you're more likely to be conscious and not seriously injured. And with regard to being thrown free of the car, the Wisconsin Department of Transportation says you are 25 times more likely to be killed if you are thrown out of the car, because you can be thrown onto hard pavement, thrown into stationary objects, or struck by other cars. Clearly, you are safer being strapped in than being thrown around. The other major reason why people don't wear seatbelts is that seatbelts are uncomfortable and restrict movement. Now, if this is your reason for not wearing a seatbelt, let me ask you to do something right now. Imagine in your mind a two-sided scale. On one side of the scale, put the value that you place on being completely comfortable while driving. And on the other side of the scale, put the value that you place on your life and your health. Which side is heavier? If your life and your health mean more to you than a little bit of extra comfort while driving, then it only makes sense to wear a seatbelt. So I'm here today to ask all of you to make a habit of wearing seatbelts. The statistics are simple. Chances are that about 1/3 of you will be in a serious auto accident at some time in your life. It could happen 50 years from now, and it could happen tomorrow. And if you are in an accident, you are 4 times more likely to be killed if you are not wearing a seatbelt than if you are wearing one. So if you think you are safer not wearing a seatbelt, you're betting against heavy odds. And if you still won't wear a seatbelt because a seatbelt is uncomfortable and inconvenient, then you're placing your momentary comfort ahead of your life and your health. So tell yourself that you're going to make a habit of wearing seatbelts. Then do it. There's nothing I can do about my accident now, and I don't plan to go around for the rest of my life kicking myself because I didn't wear a seatbelt that day. What's important is that I learned something from the experience. I've made a habit of wearing seatbelts when I ride in a car, and I'm hoping that each of you will do the same if you haven't already. I will never be able to play basketball or go downhill skiing again, but at least I'm here, and at least I can walk. I was a lot luckier than 35,000 other Americans that year.